I should start by observing that, like Ned and Bob, Robert Griffin was my teacher as well, although I took his course somewhat later. The stated topic of this session is Trump's trade policies, so I'm going to pull a fast one and talk about Trump's trade policies. Where to start? I think we should start by asking what Mr. Trump's trade policies are designed to achieve, and given that, whether they are fit for purpose, let me list 6 of the stated objectives. Number 1, to enhance U.S. national security. Will they enhance U.S. national security? Answering that question requires asking some ancillary questions. Does Canada pose a threat to U.S. national security? Does taxing steel and aluminum imports from Canada enhance U.S. national security? Will taxing motor vehicle imports from Europe or South Korea enhance U.S. national security? I'm not going to bother answering these questions because I think they answer themselves. Second objective, to extract useful concessions in negotiations with our NAFTA partners. On the whole, it hasn't worked out that way. Our taxes on Canadian steel and aluminum have so angered our Canadian friends that those negotiations have come more difficult, and I think the cosmetic concessions that have been extracted from Mexico are of the strongly welfare-reducing type from the US perspective. Objective number 3, strengthen the trade and current account balance. So here I think we've heard a little bit of a disagreement between the 2 previous speakers. In my view, tariffs obviously have had and will have no such effect. The current account of the balance of payments is determined by savings and investment, neither of which will be much affected by tariffs. Insofar as those tariffs are applied selectively, they will simply divert imports into the United States from some source countries to others. If they're applied uniformly, they will simply be offset to a first approximation by proportional strengthening of the dollar exchange rate, a point that another Columbia professor, Robert Mundell, made about 60 years ago. Objective number 4, render US manufacturing more competitive. In fact, the majority of tariffs to date have been levied on intermediate inputs into manufacturing and on capital equipment. And this is again true of 3/4 of the $200 billion worth of tariffs on imports from China that the Trump administration is now purportedly proposing to announce later this week. These are all inputs into production. Taxes on them render US manufacturing less competitive. It's been widely observed that for every steel and aluminum job created by the United States as a result of the Trump administration's tariffs, multiple downstream jobs are lost. And that's precisely the point. That's what you expect if you were taxing inputs into the domestic manufacturing process. Objective number 5, accelerate the long-term growth of the US economy. Trump's tariffs have the effect of shifting resources into old-line manufacturing, things like steel and aluminum, and away from high-tech activities that make use of artificial intelligence, robotics, biotech, take your pick. Which of these broad segments of the economy, in your view, have the greater potential for productivity growth? And finally, objective number 6, create more good jobs for hardworking Americans in manufacturing. The evidence, and here I strongly disagree with what Bob said a moment ago, the empirical evidence on the decline in manufacturing employment in the United States is that the majority of the decline that we have seen in the last 2, 3, 4 decades has been due to technological change, skilled labor using and unskilled labor saving technical change, mechanization and not import competition, it follows that stifling import competition won't bring back those jobs. It will not turn back the progress of skill-biased technological change. Trump's tariffs will be good for American robots, not for American workers. So what's the common explanation for these 6 policy failures? One answer is simple economic illiteracy. In some respects, this illiteracy takes the form of a failure to understand basic economic logic. In other respects, it reflects a failure to understand how the US economy has been changing. The structure of the economy has been changing to where the vast majority of employment, high productivity employment with high productivity growth potential is in services, in sectors that supply healthcare services, business services, personal services, and the like. The sectors with the greatest potential for productivity growth are high-tech services, not old-line manufacturing. Moreover, today, to the extent that manufacturing has high value added and has the potential for higher value added, that is associated with global supply chains, which are critical to its competitiveness. And we see evidence of this in the opposition to Trump's tariffs from even the US motor vehicle producers, who source parts and components not only throughout North America, but globally. But Trump continues to measure productivity, competitiveness, economic prowess by number of cars produced and tons of steel rolled. But I also think there has been another source of this policy failure, this one for which economists, mainstream economists, are partly to blame. To put it very simply, too many economists forgot the Stoper-Samuelson theorem, or so it would appear. As a profession, we did too little to emphasize that globalization doesn't automatically raise all boats. There are losers as well as winners from openness and international competition. And partly as a result of that, public policy did too little, it continues to do little to compensate the losers by giving them the education and training they need for productive employment in the 21st century, by providing them with relocation allowances, by pursuing place-based policies, by supplementing economic openness with an equitable tax system. In my latest book, everybody has a comment along those lines. I argue that there are deep-seated reasons rooted in American history why the United States is singularly unsuccessful, indeed unwilling, to provide these kind of basic public goods, reasons rooted in the country's historic racial divide and in the deep and abiding suspicion of federal government bequeathed by that divide, but that's a different story. Finally, let me speak to the one valid concern raised by Trump's trade strategists, which concerns China's treatment of foreign intellectual property. I'm not talking here about China 2025, which I think has been mentioned. I think Glenn Hubbard mentioned it earlier, which is China's industrial policy cum development strategy, in which it's seeking to position itself as a leader in a variety of high-tech sectors. Governments are entitled to pursue industrial policies. Governments are entitled to have development strategies. All countries have industrial policies and development strategies of one sort or another, some more successful than others. The question is whether those policies and strategies discriminate against US firms and do so in damaging ways. Here I do think that there is a solid argument that requiring US firms wishing to invest and produce in China as a condition of doing so to enter into joint venture agreements with Chinese partners in which the US firm is required to share its proprietary technology and to give up its intellectual property after 10 years is seriously damaging. The US firm can opt to stay out of China, of course, but it then loses access to the Chinese market, given China's own tariffs, and it loses access to China's talented labor force. I see no reason why Chinese firms shouldn't be permitted to license US technologies on market terms. I see no reason why Chinese firms shouldn't be permitted to, shouldn't be encouraged to develop their own competing technologies. The Chinese government can use tax policies and even subsidies to encourage these practices subject to World Trade Organization rules, but forced technology transfer through joint ventures is, I think, another story. The question, though, is what should the United States do about these practices? It's clear that tariffs are, at best, an oblique and ineffective way of pressuring China to change these practices. Better, I think, would be to consider one or several of the following options. Number one, negotiate a bilateral investment treaty with China that sets out clearly what is acceptable practice and what is unacceptable practice. And you will recall, I hope, that the Obama administration was attempting to negotiate just such a treaty but ran out of time in 2016. Number two, obtain remedies through the WTO rules that are embedded in the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS. TRIPS forbids discrimination in the application of intellectual property protection, but that requires the United States to remain a committed, supportive member of the World Trade Organization. Enough said. And third, join together with other countries in pursuing these remedies, since forming a coalition of the willing will make it that much more difficult and costly for China not to concede. Again, this, you will recall, was precisely what the Obama administration was trying to do by negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So the one thing these approaches have in common is that they have a greater probability of succeeding if the US works together in its trade policy, trade and intellectual property policy initiatives, if it works together with other countries. And that, of course, is precisely the opposite of the approach taken by the Trump administration.